Hello, this is Kent Philpott again. This is part 2 on our the series Santeria from slavery to slavery. The African slaves brought the Yoruba religion. Sometimes it was called Lukumi, and the people were called Lukumi. The language sometimes will be called Lukumi. That's Lucumi. And about 1511, African slaves brought to the New World. Brought to Cuba. They first went to Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and then these African slaves brought the Orishas with them, a kind of animistic religion. In 1521, African slaves started to be transported directly to Cuba, and the slaves ultimately worked producing sugar and coffee primarily. Now, practitioners of Santeria in Cuba were under pressure to hide their Yoruba religious concepts, so they learned to mask or merge their faith with that of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, it was plain to the people who they were acquainted with that there was magic involved in what they were doing. There was animal sacrifices and other things that were not, that culture was not accustomed to, and it was just evident through for very blatant reasons that the African religion needed to be hidden, and the code of silence has been long a mainstay of Santeria, kind of changing these days because of the desire to be more open in the American society and so on, but very much relegated to secrecy, underground all the way. But they had to do it because the Roman Catholic Church was not really going for what they were believing in at first, and so there was kind of an immersion of the Orisha, worship of the Orishas, into the worship of the saints, and so that's the way it worked. And already in place in that Iberian Catholicism was the concept of the immortality of the soul, which led to prayers and offerings made to people that were dead, which was quite exactly what was going on in Africa with the Orishas. So the churches were full of carved and painted images of departed people who had been declared saints, but who could, if handled rightly, grant requests. So masking the Yoruba deities with the Catholic saints was a means of keeping the old religion alive. Very adaptable these people were, even if it meant giving new names to the Orishas, and that's what they did. Catholicism was the seedbed of the survival of the Orishas. The Catholic Church allowed ethnic associations called cabildos to form and develop, wherein African dancers worshipped before Catholic images, mostly the Virgin and the older saints. This, combined with the blindness of the clergymen, unhappily, who did not understand what they were seeing, made certain West African slaves, meant that certain African slaves could keep their spiritual identity. Some say it was a form of syncretism. Raul Canizares says was not, because the belief systems were not combined or intertwined. Rather, Spanish Catholicism was a cover to continue to worship the old gods and goddesses without upsetting or alarming the Catholic hierarchy. Now, the Yoruba practitioners identified each Orisha with a Catholic saint. Obatala, one of the chief gods of the Yoruba religion, became known as Our Lady of Ransom. Of course, the lady would be the Virgin Mary. Elegua, and I probably mispronounced that, with Anthony of Padua, Martin Porres Benito, the Holy Infant of Prague, and the Holy Child of Tosha. Orunla with Francis of Assisi, St. Philip, and St. Joseph. Chango with St. Barbara. St. Mark, St. Jerome, St. Elijah, and St. Bartholomew. Ochosi with St. Norbert, St. Albert, St. Hubert, St. James. Ogun with St. Peter, St. James, and St. John the Baptist, and St. Paul, the Archangel Michael as well. Babaluai with Lazarus. Yemaya with Our Lady of Regla. Osain with St. Sylvester, St. John, St. Ambrose, St. Anthony Abad, St. Joseph, and St. Benito. Aganu with St. Christopher, Archangel Michael, St. Joseph. Oko with St. Isidora. Inlay with Angel Raphael. Oba with St. Rita of Cassia, St. Catalina of Siena, the Virgin of Carmen, and so on. Now, devotion to and worship of the Orishas was carried out beneath the images of the Catholic saints, despite the fact that that church did not endorse or embrace the Yoruba Orishas. Sometimes the African religion was opposed, at other times it was simply ignored. And I have seen other evidence that they had a tendency to combine sometimes. Even Jesus was brought into the old world religion, given new definition, roles, and personhood, and became known as Olofi. The Orisha worshippers clearly necessarily adapted to a strange and hostile environment and succeeded in preserving their gods and forms of worship. In this way, they were able to resist being completely subsumed by the European majority. To survive then, the Yoruba slaves created a seeming alliance with the dominant religion. The Spanish Catholic Church did not demand doctrinal adherence to nor an understanding of those doctrines. Usually, the converts became so under duress. Often, hundreds were merely sprinkled with holy water, sometimes while wearing their chains. African slaves were dispersed throughout the region, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and to other nations of South America, most notably Brazil and Venezuela. In 1959 and the revolution under Fidel Castro, hundreds of thousands of Cubans fled from Cuba to the United States, principally to Miami and New York. In 1980, a flood more worshippers of the Orishas were literally pushed off the island of Cuba. Now most American cities with any sizable Hispanic Caribbean population will host those who keep the worship of the ancient deities alive. Compared to the Catholics, however, the Protestants were not as welcoming to the Yoruba Orishas. Membership in Protestant churches was more clearly defined and regulated. Mere baptism was not enough. Doctrine mattered, as did a commitment to Scripture, which had a decidedly negative view of idol worship and occult practices. The Protestant denomination presented a narrow gate rather than the wide gate of Catholicism. Catholicism required little of the slaves beyond attendance at the sacraments. Indeed, the Catholicism of colonial Cuba was perhaps not so terribly unlike the religion of the Yoruba homeland. That is the end of part 2.